Okay.
Hi 6th grade Tigers, welcome to my kitchen. Today I'm going to demonstrate the chicken and zucchini bites, but before we get started we're going to do what we always do before we start cooking, and we know it's hands washed, aprons on, sink set up. So I'm going to wash my hands with hot soapy water for 20 to 30 seconds. And don't forget that you might have to wash your hands multiple times during this lab today because our goal is to avoid cross-contamination. So when I dry my hands, make sure I use a paper towel, and I'm just going to use half my paper towel now and put that right into the trash can. Alright, so the ingredients that I need today are some chicken breasts, and we're going to just cut those into small pieces, and I'll get to that in just a second. My next ingredient is a half a cup of whole wheat breadcrumbs, and I think I've talked to you guys a couple of times about my food allergy, which is gluten and wheat. So I'm going to use a gluten-free panko breadcrumb today, and I'm also going to mix it with other breadcrumbs. So if you've never had panko breadcrumbs, make sure you try them. They don't have to be gluten-free, but they're basically a Japanese breadcrumb, and they're really light and crispy. They're going to make this recipe so delicious. And then you can also just use regular breadcrumbs. The next ingredient that I'm going to need is a tablespoon of Parmesan cheese, and you can just use a grated Parmesan cheese like this. If you want a great fresh Parmesan cheese, go for it, but try to put the Parmesan cheese in it. If you're lactose intolerant, then just omit the Parmesan cheese. I think I talked to you before about how you want to spice this up. We're all from Maryland, so if you want to put a little Old Bay seasoning in there, that's certainly optional. And then whenever I get the chance to add something healthy to my recipes, I add something called nutritional yeast. You don't have to, but I'm going to have that out for you guys to try. I have some salt and pepper. And then the recipe calls for butter. If you are lactose intolerant or you are a vegan, you can use a plant-based butter if you want. It melts beautifully and works really well with this. And if you want, you can just omit the egg. But we are going to use an egg in today's recipe. And a couple things you want to think about. We know that we can cross-contaminate with food items like eggs, chicken, because they have bacteria on it. So be sure to wash your hands after working with eggs, and definitely after working with chicken. So if you are a vegan or a vegetarian, I still have a great way for you to make this recipe. Chop up some zucchini. You can even use a sweet potato that's been cooked. There are a lot of alternatives to this. So I'm going to go ahead and crack my eggs so I have it ready. When you're cooking though, please be sure to keep a cutting board for your meats and a cutting board for your vegetables separated. In our classroom, you're going to use the colored cutting boards for your meats and the big white cutting board for your vegetables. So before I wash my hands, I'm going to come to my chicken, and I'm going to cut that with my kitchen shears into little bites. Now if you're going to make this for dinner, you don't have to make it into little bites. Bites are great for a snack. You can make the bites ahead of time like we're going to do in class. But if you want to make this into a meal, go ahead and just leave it into strips, just increase your cooking time. But when I'm working with this chicken, please notice that I'm staying in one spot. I'm not walking around with the raw meats, and I just really want to be careful not to cross-contaminate. So anything that is with a raw chicken, you're going to keep either on this pan or in this kind of centralized location. The reason I have my tongs out is some people don't like to touch raw meat, and if you don't, you can actually use your tongs. And sometimes using tongs in the kitchen reduces your chances of cross-contaminating. Just when you're done with them, put them into the sink. Now you guys saw that I'm working with the chicken. What I want to avoid now is touching things like turning on the water and going over maybe touching some vegetables. So be sure that you're keeping these hands from cross-contaminating. Just really think about that. Okay, so I'm going to put my chicken in the bag that it says to put into the recipe. I'll have that out for in just a few seconds, but I definitely want to wash my hands. I'm getting a little concerned that I'm going to cross-contaminate. So I'm going to wash my hands again for 20 to 30 seconds. And some of those other safety skills we've been talking about is if you have a knife, make sure you don't put your knife in hot soapy water, so if somebody comes around to wash the dishes, they don't reach in it and cut themselves by accident. You always want to have a clean workspace, and that's called practicing mise en place. All right, let's go over and look at some of our measuring. And I have that paper towel close by, and that goes right into the trash can because I washed my hands again. All right, so my first ingredient was the chicken breast, and I cut that up into cubes. That's a cooking term, obviously, little squares. And then I need a half a cup of whole wheat breadcrumbs. So I'm going to take my dry measuring cup, and if you can see, I have all of my utensils lined up in order that I'm going to need. I'm going to get my breadcrumbs, and I'm going to measure a half a cup, and I'm going to level off with a spatula. And if I don't have a spatula handy, I can just use something that has a straight edge. And I'm going to put that right here, and I want you to get used to lining your ingredients up in order and cleaning as you go, okay? And again, you can use a mixture of panko breadcrumbs and regular breadcrumbs if you want. So my next ingredient is 1 to 2 tablespoons of grated Parmesan cheese. So I want to take my measuring spoons. You can just use a little cup if you want. In our classroom, we have custard cups that we would put these in, but any sort of little dish. And we want to get used to the skill of lining everything up in order. This isn't the most necessary thing to do for this recipe, but when we start baking, this really keeps us organized. So again, clean as you go. When you do your home cooking assignment, I want your parents to give you all those points for being organized in the kitchen. So practice this. The ingredient I need after that is a little bit of salt and pepper, just to save us some doing some dishes. You can take a pinch of your salt and pepper. I like to use kosher salt. You guys can try that in my classroom. We also have some pink Himalayan salt you can practice. And then a couple of squeezes of fresh ground pepper. You can come into my kitchen at school and go ahead and grab the pepper mill and use that. All right, the next thing you're gonna need is a beaten egg. So I already have the egg ready to go. You could use a whisk, but that's not gonna work real well for here. So if a recipe tells you to beat something, it's okay on occasion to just use a fork. All right, so you wanna beat that egg. And don't forget, that egg has salmonella, possibly, and bacteria on it. So just be careful not to cross-contaminate. So in my liquid measuring cup, I went ahead and measured a couple of tablespoons of my butter, and I let it cool. But before I put it in the microwave, I put a piece of plastic wrap on it. You can see I'm struggling with that a little bit. And I melted it for about 20 seconds in the microwave. You guys can walk into any of the kitchens and use the microwaves. And I want to make sure that the butter is nice and cool before I add that egg. If I poured that egg into the hot butter, it would scramble them. So you want to make sure that the egg cools. All right, the next ingredient that I want to get set up is, I think we're good to go. If you take a look at the equipment that you need, the recipe tells you to get a plastic bag for your breadcrumbs and your spices. I went ahead and did that already. So in a round cake pan, we put the chicken that's been cubed and our breadcrumbs, and this is a 2-day lab. So I labeled my round cake pan and I put it in the refrigerator, and we're gonna come back and do day 2. So for day 2, I'm gonna get my jelly roll pan, and I have a small one here, but you guys use the bigger ones. And I lined it with some foil, and I definitely want to hit this with some cooking spray. Be careful with cooking spray because it can make the floors really slippery. Not so long ago, I had some really interesting 8th graders that got in a little trouble for this, but they thought it would be really funny to spray the floors with cooking spray. Well, you can imagine it made the floors very slippery. I'm telling you not to do that. Don't get any crazy ideas. All right, so your jelly roll pan should be sprayed with cooking spray. If you want to, you can also use a piece of parchment paper, but if you don't have parchment paper, this works really well. All right, So I want to make sure that I am lined up in a safe place to go ahead and put this recipe together. So I'm going to take my breadcrumbs and put them in my mixing bowl. And I want to have my egg mixture and then my breadcrumbs and then my chicken. So I'm a little tight for space here, so I'm going to come out here. I'm going to open up my breadcrumbs. Can you film that okay? All right, so I'm going to take a couple of pieces of my chicken and I'm going to squish it around in there. And if you do not like touching raw meat, then you might want to get the supply cook to help you out on this task if you are assigned lead cook. All right, make sure that your breadcrumbs are really sticking to the chicken and the zucchini. When you guys are in class, I like you to do a jelly roll pan or a baking sheet with the chicken and then a whole baking pan with the zucchini. We definitely want to try to get as many vegetables in our diets as we possibly can. All right, so you can space these apart, and your hands are going to be full of breadcrumbs, a little bit of butter and egg, so be sure to come into my kitchen and wash those hands, or if you're at home making these, be sure to wash your hands and then wipe out the sinks. In just a few minutes, I'll show you what these chicken bites look like.